Okay, so welcome everyone to our special Sunday supper for Tadaima's virtual community pilgrimage program. So this is part of an ongoing 9-week series of daily virtual pilgrimage content that we're bringing to the community in lieu of in-person pilgrimage programs that were all canceled across the country this year because of the pandemic. So we're really glad that we could still bring you this sort of programming and reach you guys, whether you're logged in at home or hopefully not at the office since it's a weekend, but we're certainly glad to be able to have you all. And today we have a very special program with author Gil Asakawa based out of Denver, Colorado. And Gil will be presenting his findings and research so far for a forthcoming book that he has coming out next year on Stonebridge Press, which should be titled Tabemasho, Let's Eat. And so it's essentially going to be a history on Japanese food in the United States. And so I think that's a subject that is immediately familiar to a lot of us in our daily lives. And I'm certainly looking forward to it. And, you know, as I love to eat, and at my day job at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California in San Francisco, Japantown, we put on a lot of culinary programs as well. So this is subject matter that not only brings me a lot of joy, but is directly relevant to the work that I do as well. So I'm really looking forward to it. For everyone in the audience today, if you do have a question for Gil, he will be answering questions from the audience periodically throughout the program. And so go ahead and in the webinar chat box or the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screens, go ahead and enter in your questions, and at appropriate times we'll let Gil answer those as we receive them. And then at the end of the presentation also, we'll take some additional time for Gil to answer the remainder of the questions. So don't be shy. If there's something that comes to mind while you're hearing Gil's presentation, feel free to ask. And in addition, just keep in mind that we are recording this session. So for those of you who want to re-watch the session after, we'll be rebroadcasting this on the Tadaima Pilgrimage website at jampilgrimages.com, so starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So with that, I'd like to let Gil introduce himself a little bit, and
we can start. Hi, everybody. My name is Gil Asakawa. I'm a journalist kind of by trade, almost a retired journalist. I wrote a book called Being Japanese American that was published by Stonebridge Press in 1994, 2004, and then a second edition in 2014, which was really fun. And they're letting me do this book about Japanese food in America. Like Haruka, I'm a kind of a foodie. I love to eat. If you follow me on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, I post pictures of food and my gardening and my cat Rufus that I showed you a minute ago. And I grew up, obviously, like all of us, eating Japanese food. My experience is a little bit different because I was born in Japan and lived there till I was 8 years old. My dad was in the U.S. military, then a civilian employee of the U.S. government. So my brother and I went to American schools on base schools, but we lived off base in Japanese neighborhoods. I had this completely bicultural upbringing, and then once we got to the U.S., my mom kept, cooking Japanese food, and so I have a very specific knowledge of Japanese food. When I got married to Erin Yoshimura, my partner, she's Yonsei, but a very, very Japanese Yonsei. And so she and her family has roots in Hiroshima and in Kyushu. So turns out that the food that she grew up with, she has kind of a wider range of food. My mom is from Hokkaido, and she thinks the world's best. A lot of things are from Hokkaido, and if she didn't know it growing up, she doesn't really care for it. So she loves shiitake. She didn't like matsutake. Once we got to Colorado and we went mushroom hunting, she just doesn't think matsutake is that cool because she grew up eating shiitake. Anyway, so my familiarity with Japanese food encompasses kind of home cooking and obviously restaurants. And I love the fact that more and more Japanese food is becoming very mainstream in the U.S. And, I've written about culture all my life. I was a music critic for many years. I was a journalist, and I taught at the university. And I started just kind of taking pictures of food. I was never really a food critic, but I just have become totally immersed in the foodie world. I'm now into knives, Japanese knives, and getting them sharpened and knowing what the different shapes are and what they're for. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen. I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to show the PowerPoint. I tend to ramble, so I apologize in advance. If I talk too long, there might be some slides I'll have to race through if we're running slow. But I am going to share the screen. Let's see if we can get this to work. Here it is. Share. All right. So here we have Tabemasho. Let's eat. This is a picture. I believe this is from San Francisco's Japantown. Takara, is that the name of the place? It's a great restaurant.
Yep.
So, okay. So there we go. Wanted to talk about, oops. Okay. Japanese food wasn't super well known. It is now. It's become very, very popular, mainstream. You have Iron Chef help kind of give it this glow of pop culture, familiarity. But for a long time, even when I was a kid, when my family moved to the States, Japanese food was kind of exotic. And in the late 1800s and early 20th century, it was really food made by immigrants for immigrants. So if there was a Japanese restaurant, most likely you were going to see Japanese people eating there, not non-Japanese. And Chinese food started that way too. They were earlier immigrants than the Japanese. They started really coming to the U.S. During the gold rush of the 1840s. And of course, they were blocked by the Chinese Exclusion Act from coming to the U.S. in the 1880s, which is when the Japanese were allowed to start coming because this country still needed cheap, hardworking labor. And the racism against the Chinese then became part of the Japanese American experience, of course. But Chinese food was first introduced by laborers and the immigrants who would make it for other immigrants. And chop suey is kind of a anecdotal tale that chop suey was something that camp cooks threw together when they were working on the railroads, connecting the transcontinental railroad from the West Coast to the East Coast. and they just threw together whatever they had on hand. And for whatever reason, it really caught on with the Japanese community later in the 1800s and the early 20th century. Chop suey was actually a pretty huge food fad in the early 20th century. And this sign here from Little Tokyo in LA is a classic. I love this neon, and it's been given historic landmark status. And the shop is no longer really a chop suey shop. It's a bar. I think it's maybe a brew pub. But the sign's still there. And we need to talk about Japanese food, up until World War II. If it was something that was meant for immigrants and something that was kind of exotic and not necessarily well known in the mainstream, it kind of evolved within the cauldron of the concentration camps during World War II. So in the book Farewell to Manzanar, which is maybe the most famous of all the kind of accounts of the camp experience, Jean Wakatsuki Houston wrote that the very first meal she remembers getting in Manzanar was canned Vienna sausage, canned string beans, steamed rice that had been cooked too long, and on top of the rice, a serving of canned apricots. Very, very, I think, culturally insensitive and inappropriate mixture. And of course, everything canned, no fresh vegetables. And that really shows how the Japanese community had to adapt how we ate in the camp experience. So, being in camp disrupted our families anyway, because if you look at a lot of the pictures of dining, in the camps, you see young children, you see older people, you don't see teenagers or anybody kind of, like 10 to 17, 18. It's because they were all off hanging out with their friends and avoiding their dragon dads and dragon moms, and being kind of free and rowdy, and it really disrupted the family structure in the Japanese community. And it also disrupted, obviously, the food we ate. Smaller portions often, and lots of different kinds of starches, replacing the fresh produce that the Japanese were used to eating, and fresh caught fish. There were famous stories of people sneaking out to go fishing so they can eat some fish when they brought it back to the camp. But families tell stories of being served almost spoiled lamb with lots of curry to cover up the smell. So the smell of curry after the war made them queasy. Because they were served this bad lamb all the time. Some JAs also got sick of eating surplus cottage cheese because they were given cottage cheese all the time. Something that Japanese would not have eaten in the pre-war era. But some menu items stuck. Winnie Royale, and I know that Tadaima presented a potluck presentation a couple of weeks ago on I think July 5th. That had a recipe for Weenie Royale, which is cut up hot dogs with ketchup and onions and shoyu and egg. Pancakes, macaroni. There were things that kind of became staples of our diet post-war. I am curious because my wife's experience, both sides of her family were in concentration camps. They ended up in Arkansas, but my family was not, because my dad was stuck in Japan during World War II. He and his brothers and sisters had been born in Hawaii, but my grandfather took them back to Japan. And my mom is from Japan. She's in Issei, or Shin Issei, I guess, from Hokkaido. So I wasn't I didn't grow up with kind of the lore of camp food or reactions to certain kinds of food because they were served all the time in camp. If you have stories about your family's food memories, I would love to hear them. So I have my email at the end, or you could find me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Just get in touch with me. I'd love to hear your stories, and if you have pictures, I'd love to see them. But there was some Japanese cooking in camp. I had read a long time ago that the Japanese government sent shipments of shoyu to each camp so that Japanese Americans could have, food with shoyu. And I, for some reason, have not been able to find confirmation of that in my recent research. But there were, most of the camps managed to find ways to make soy, tofu, shoyu, tofu, and miso with soybeans. The shoyu that they made wasn't fermented though, because it takes too much time and probably too much space too. So they were making HVP or HPV shoyu, which is made with amino acids and various chemicals, and it cuts down the time. But I found it interesting that there were ways to at least make these two fundamental things for Japanese cuisine in the camps. Now, after the war, a lot of the cooking ideas, both from pre-war, during the camps, and then what was kind of being thrown around in our kitchens after the war, they were captured in a lot of cookbooks. We've all seen them. You probably have some in your cupboards. These are just some that my wife has. And then the St. Louis JACL sent me their Nisei Kitchen cookbook, which is really nice of them when they heard that I was doing a book about the history of Japanese food in the US. And one of the most interesting, and these are all like the Buddhist temple, Denver Buddhist temple, Gardena, is that a Buddhist temple in Gardena, Brighton, Japanese Women's Association. Brighton's a small town northeast of Denver. And then some other ones we have here from LA, from the LA area. And they were, some of them were written in the 60s, some in the 70s. The St. Louis JACL cookbook is from 1975, and it's been reprinted every few years since then as a fundraiser for the St. Louis chapter of JACL. And then a lot of these books, like the Denver Buddhist Temple one, have been reprinted as well. And apparently the Denver Buddhist Temple and the Simpson United Methodist Church are both about to reprint their versions of a cookbook in the next year or two. So this is the way that our community has kind of captured our food memory. And what's really, really interesting about them is that they span the range. Yeah, there's a lot of Japanese food, but they have things like, wieners, hot dogs with shoyu and ketchup fried up. And they have things like a lot of Chinese dishes. They have spaghetti, and the ones, at least from Denver, the Denver area, they have like enchiladas and tacos and burritos and very, very culturally, it's a mashup of ethnic cultures that are relevant within our community. I know that my wife's family used to own a grocery store where they had a lot of Mexican laborers come in, and so they had things like menudo on hand. So the Japanese community, I think, has always been very open to lots of influences and to adapting to things. Oh, and there's a slide that I didn't put in here that I should have. There's a pretty popular brand of salsa here that was made here in Colorado called Karami. I believe Janum in LA sells it. It might be available on Amazon. Some of the Whole Foods in this area sell it. It's a salsa that's made from green chilies, Pueblo green chilies in Colorado. And it's because it was a Japanese American community dish that the Japanese Americans in southern Colorado kind of started to make, because green chilies have a little bit of a slimy texture that approximated kombu. So it was their way of making, a condiment to go with rice. And so we've always adapted food to fit our needs and fit, what's available in our geography and what's available culturally in society at the time. I think that's a really fascinating thing. After World War II, when you look outside the Japanese community and Japanese American community, mainstream Americans had a very limited knowledge of Japanese food. Sukiyaki, tempura, teriyaki. Sukiyaki is probably the main one that people know, partly because of the 1963 #1 song, Ue o muite aruko. It's a song that I love because I remember hearing it in 1961, even when I was, 4 years old in Japan. And then it became a hit a couple of years later in the US. When it came to, it's called Ue o muite, looking up, Ue o muite aruko, which is looking up as I walk, and tears are streaming down my head. And it was named Sukiyaki for the Western consumer because some record label exec said, "No, we can't use that Japanese title. That's too hard. What's a good Japanese word?" And they should have used Sayonara because it's really a song about heartbreak, and it would have been the perfect name. And Americans knew Sayonara, partly because of the 1958 movie with Marlon Brando, but instead they decided to call it Sukiyaki, which just bugs the hell out of me. But it's not about food, but the song is really well known, and it's, in a way, I've heard it called the Japanese American anthem, because when it became #1 in 1963, it was in time for the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo, and it was the sign for Japanese Americans, certainly, that it was okay to be Japanese for the first time in decades. Ultimately, of course, it wasn't okay, but you could have a little bit of pride in being Japanese. So that's a really important song, and it's because of the knowledge of the word sukiyaki. In 1964, same year as the Tokyo Olympics, Benihana came to America, and see, I have to say America because it's I want it to be more Japanese than it kind of is. This is super important. I don't know how many of you have eaten at a Benihana, but it is really a major moment in, I think, the history of Japanese food that, hold on here, it's not gonna let me see the chat. So Haruka, you might have to break in if there's any questions I need to answer.
At the moment, none so far.
Okay. But I didn't want to show. Oh, there you go. I have the chat open now. The first Benihana was opened in New York City in Manhattan in 1964. And it was the idea of Rocky Aoki. And he thought that there would be a way to make Japanese food in a way that would be appealing to Americans. And he was right, because he turned Japanese food into a show. Never mind that in Japan, eating this much beef was actually still pretty rare. Beef was something that was introduced to Japan in the 1800s. And, by far, fish was still the main ingredient in a lot of Japanese foods, fish and vegetables. But now there are 115 benihanas all over the world. Some have closed. There used to be, I think, 3 in the Denver area, and now there's only, I think there's still one. Yeah, there's still one. But what Benihana did by turning it into showbiz and kind of jokingly, tossing the shrimp into the chef's hat and making the onion volcano, all this corny stuff, it made Japanese food safe and familiar. It made it kind of okay to get a little chawan of rice with the steak that you're loving, and the vegetables. And it made it okay to have the butter and shoyu combination of flavorings, and garlic, of course. And it made it okay to have like miso soup, that it was no longer this weird, mysterious thing. And those are kind of the milestones that helped Japanese food become not just familiar, but acceptable, mainstream. I love this picture from the Benihana website because, it's an Asian chef serving a white family, and it is kind of the capsule of the point, I think, of Benihana. In the West Coast, you guys in California and in the Northwest, and also if you're from New York, you're lucky because you've always had enough Japanese population and Japanese American population that you've had good restaurants and a number of restaurants to dine at. But in Denver, before Benihana came in the 1970s, there are only three that my family remembers. One of them, 20th Street Cafe, which is a great greasy spoon. And they serve things like, just a few months ago, I had udon before the pandemic struck. I had udon with an egg, and they had lokomoko. They had killer chicken fried steak and wonderful pancakes. And they had this magic flavor to everything that they made. They actually closed down after 75 years. It was owned by the 3rd generation of the same JA family. And I did a video interview with them just the other day so that we can at least capture some of their stories. But more and more going into the 80s, Japanese restaurants became familiar. They started popping up. And in the 1980s and 1990s, sushi caught on, primarily first as food for hipsters and yuppies. As a status symbol that that you could A, afford this stuff, and B, that you were interested in eating this stuff. And today sushi's become so accepted you can find it in supermarkets, and young kids eat it like several times a week. And I include this picture here of the sushi things at the bottom. Those are little stuffed sushi that I got from the dollar store. They were just in a basket at the checkout, and to me that was a real sign that sushi is now so mainstream that people think it makes a cute little keychain trinket. So sushi has become very mainstream, and here's proof from 1985.
Oh, Gil, I think your audio isn't being heard on the.
Too bad. That is, we should have tested this before. Sorry about that, folks. If you don't recognize it, this is a scene from the movie, 1985 movie, The Breakfast Club. And Molly Ringwald, kind of the brainy, spoiled kid that's in detention with these other kids. She's eating sushi for lunch, and the others think it's just unbelievably gross that she's eating sushi. And when you think about it, this is 1985, and I remember having conversations even in 1985 where um, people would say, "Oh, what is that? Oh, you eat raw fish? That's gross." And so it's amazing to think that sushi in 30 years has come this far as something that's just common and normal. And although I think it's weird that she has like a soy sauce bottle instead of a packet, but hey, it's the movies, suspension of disbelief and all that. So yeah, sorry that the audio doesn't work. I should have set that up somehow so that it would. Don't know how to do that, but we'll figure it out for next time.
Yeah,
So
Gil,
that's
actually, you can do it if you exit out of your share screen and then restart it. But before the share screen starts, you toggle on the audio share. If you want to.
oh, there's an audio share. Okay, well, since I just described it, I don't think I have to do that. You guys get the point now, but you can find it actually on YouTube. Go to YouTube and look for the Breakfast Club Sushi Lunch. And it's a hilarious little scene. And it says a lot about people's perceptions of Japanese food then versus now. And the other thing about sushi and what helped make it mainstream, benihana, like I said, steak wasn't something that is so strange to Americans, right? California roll is a very interesting story because when they first became popular in the 80s, early 90s, I showed my mom one at a sushi restaurant, and she says, "Hey, inchiki sushi yo," and it really it grossed her out because to her that was not sushi to have rice on the outside, so she thought it was fake. Well, fake, yes, but it was a gateway food to real sushi, and it was invented depending on which story you believe. And I kind of prefer the Vancouver one because the sushi chef up there, got a citation award from the Japanese government. But the impetus for inventing California roll was that they had to put the rice on the outside because Americans were grossed out by the idea of eating seaweed. So no nori on the outside. And the other thing is that they put avocado in there. My mom got grossed out by having avocado in any sushi. It's because avocado had the same kind of texture as maguro, as tuna, but Americans wouldn't eat it. So the sushi chef decided to put avocado in there instead. And that's why you have, voila, the California roll with fake crab with a K, avocado, and nori and rice on the outside. But these things actually help people get comfortable with the idea of eating sushi. And once you could eat that and you would feel proud and you tell your friend, yeah, I eat sushi, they might try something else. In 1966, the first major real Japanese restaurant to serve sushi was Kawafuku in LA. And note though that the building, this photo is from Discover Nikkei, note that the building sign says Kawafuku, and then it says Sukiyaki next to it. But they were the first to start serving sushi as a major component in 1966. But remember, that movie, Breakfast Club, was 1985, and it was still something kind of new and exotic to certainly to young people in the U.S., even up until the mid 80s. In the Denver area, we would go to this place called Fujian or Benihana for special occasions. And the book, Tabemasho, I'm going to do some research and I'll have photos from the LA area, from Seattle, hopefully Chicago and New York as well, of some early Japanese restaurants and what they look like. So this is a photo that I found from a pamphlet and an ad in a local Japanese community guide for Fujian. And notice that the little ad says specializing in Sukiyaki and Tempura. This is from the late 60s, maybe early 70s. And they didn't have a sushi bar at the time. But that's where my family would go to have real Japanese food. Of course, today, the big thing is ramen. So ramen is huge, popular. A lot of us grew up with instant ramen or went through college with instant ramen, 7 cents a pack. I mean, how could you lose? Or cup of noodles. And we're familiar with it on that level. But the history goes back further than that, maybe not hundreds of years. It's based on a Chinese noodle dish, la mian, and the Chinese laborers used to sell it as street food at the docks of Yokohama. And Japanese first started kind of tasting it that way. And not too long ago, like my mom would call it shina soba, Chinese soba. It's not like ramen is not a real thing on its own, or it's not Japanese. So you got to identify it as Chinese noodles. Japan slowly took it on and adapted it and made it more Japanese by adding different kinds of very specific Japanese flavors, primarily dashi, fish stock, and shoyu to the soup. And after World War II in Japan, ramen really became mainstream in Japan because the US, there was a famine in Japan, very poor rice crop, and the US government dumped a bunch of surplus wheat onto Japan, made the Japanese government buy it to help out American farmers. And that's why like different kinds of bread and bakeries and ramen noodles became much, much bigger in Japan after World War II because they were faced with using all this wheat. So then you get, like the instant ramen by Nissin was invented in 1958, and then cup noodles in 1971. And it's become a national food. So there's little regions of Japan have specialized different kinds of ramen, and where you have tonkotsu in Kyushu, which is the pig and chicken bones that are simmered for 20 hours. Shoyu ramen in Tokyo. You have miso ramen in the cold part of Japan in Hokkaido and Sapporo. And so different areas came up with their specialties. And now all those places, different flavors are represented in ramen in the USA. The way that you can tell that ramen's become a mainstream Japanese dish now is that more and more you can see restaurant signs spelling ramen in hiragana instead of katakana. The katakana alphabet, of course, is used for foreign words. And in the past, you would see it in the angular katakana alphabet. And now it's become more common to see ramen written on hiragana on signs. So I think that the real acceptance, even in the high levels of Japan, that ramen is now a Japanese thing. Some of you, if you're younger, if you're a fan of anime, you may have been, surprised to see authentic Japanese dishes. Well, I guess not, because anime is Japanese, but it's been a way for non-Japanese to see and become curious about Japanese food, because you can see, all these kare is curry rice is shown in anime, taiyaki, the little pastries with anko in them. Of course, ramen, musubi, the rice balls. There are real life examples that are based on anime. And then takoyaki, the octopus balls. These are just some examples. There's a website that has 20 Japanese foods that have appeared in anime with their real life counterparts next to them. So pretty interesting to show that young people in some ways are getting more of an introduction to Japanese food than we did. And then I just wanted to show you some of the pictures that I've posted on Instagram over the years of Japanese food. Of course, I'm planning on covering Japanese food in Hawaii, which is a whole different animal, really. Spam musubi is so commonplace and so much part of our kind of food vernacular. That's a Hawaiian Japanese adaptation. Different kinds of food. That Red Bull with the tofu that's at a restaurant right at the base of Tokyo Tower in Tokyo. This is just all making me hungry, actually. Shabu shabu, sashimi, tempura, all the main stuff. So we have what, like 15 minutes left, 10 minutes left. Any questions or discussion? I'd love to hear your stories. Here's my email, gil@nikkeiview.com or gilasakawa@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your stories, family stories about food. Had a friend, a white friend, just the other day, tell me that he grew up with his mom had worked for the occupation after the war. And so when she came back, she brought back some Japanese dolls and cultural things and some recipes. So he remembered her making Japanese food and inviting all their white neighbors and friends over. And she would introduce them to the Japanese food that she made. Those are the kinds of stories I'd love to hear about. I'd love to see pictures of your food history. And if your family owned a restaurant, or if you took pictures at restaurants, family pictures, I'd love to see old restaurants and the food in their context. So any questions? Or I'm going to go to the chat box again.
Yeah, so we have some questions coming in.
Yes.
Earlier on, actually, we had a question submitted by John Tonai, I guess in response to an interview that you were referencing. He said that it's sad that 20th Street closed, but I'd like to know where he might be able to see the interview that you referenced.
Well, it'll take me probably a week to actually edit the video down. I'm not a multimedia. I am a multimedia guy, but I'm terrible at video editing. I have to do a lot of work to do that. So it'll take me a while, but I will let you all know when I do that and when it's available. It was sad to hear it close. My wife grew up with her family eating there, and we've eaten there a whole bunch in the last decade and a half, and it was sad to see them close. They closed because of the pandemic, and that they tried to do takeout only at first, but it just really wasn't enough business to keep it going. So, and they were old, the owners have been at it for, he grew up at the restaurant, and he has basically run it for 20, 25 years himself. So it was time.
Okay, great. Yeah, definitely look forward to that. Next question we have, I think Joyce had a clarifying question about ramen.
Tonkotsu?
Yeah.
I see the question. Tonkotsu can have both pork and chicken bones. I had some of the best that I've ever had was in Kyoto, actually, and they explained that they have both pork and chicken. Typically, like shoyu and shio ramen in Japan and other parts of Japan, in Tokyo and other parts of Japan, use chicken bones primarily, unless it's dashi with fish stock. But and there are parts of Kyushu where it's just pork bones. but I kind of like the one with the chicken and pork. There's places, I think it's called Tsujita in LA, and Sawtell. It's a Japanese chain. Has tonkotsu that they're real proud of, and it clearly they just use pork bones. And after about 3 minutes in front of you, the bowl has this kind of layer of, I don't know, it's like Vaseline that you have to cut through to get to the soup. And I can't get into, I just can't get into it.
Right. Our next question is from Janice. She asked, I guess, pre-World War II on the mainland, it seems a fair number of JAs ran Chinese, quote unquote, chop suey restaurants. Do you think that some of these Chinese foods have influenced or filtered down into JA home cooking?
Yeah, I mean, because we still make, a lot of us still make chop suey, right? I mean, we made it just the other day for family, where we pan fried the noodles, and we use lots of celery, and I think there are lots of things, we may not use all the traditional Chinese elements, 5-spice and some of those other things. We've made it kind of a JA version, but we've had it in restaurants that kind of tastes the same. In fact, the 20th Street Cafe used to sell to make it, and it was really good. So, and I think there are lots of Chinese dishes that we've adapted and that we make in Chinese restaurants. I mean, in Japanese restaurants, but we don't necessarily, we know that they're Chinese dishes. So, I think if you're in a Japanese restaurant and you see, I don't know, chop suey, I don't know if you necessarily see that so much anymore, but they know that it's originally a Chinese dish. So.
I guess similarly, we have a question from Tom asking, what about buta tofu, pork tofu? He's 99% sure it's a JA dish, but he hasn't found any references to it in Japanese online, or for any Gene he's asked, they haven't heard of it. Do you know anything about its origin? I'm wondering if he might be referring to mapo tofu. I'm not.
Yeah, they're mapo tofu and buta tofu they're kind of related, but they are different. Erin, my wife, her family makes both. And my mom, being from Hokkaido, didn't make a lot of things. I can say that things with pork often have a Chinese origin, because pork wasn't a typical meat. Never mind beef. Beef was introduced in like the late 1800s as a meat, and pork was introduced earlier, but it's from China. That's why in Okinawa you see lots of pork dishes. In Kyushu, in southern Japan, you see a lot of pork dishes. I'm actually looking here in the Nikkei kitchen book in the St. Louis JCL. Desserts, New Year's food, Chinese, seafood, poultry, and meats. Not seeing. Okay, buta tofu is in here. Pork and bean curd and sauce, 118. Now, the one thing about this book, and I've seen some other cookbooks that have a little bit of context, that might explain where things are from. No, this is just a recipe, buta tofu. So it's out there and it's available. And this identifies it as a Japanese dish because there's a section in here of Chinese dishes. It's something that I'm familiar with, as well as mapo tofu. But I think mapo tofu is accepted as being more Chinese. So that's interesting. Something to think about. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap and crossover between the two cultures.
Right. Next one is not necessarily a question, just a small anecdote from Erin. saying he remembers in high school in the early 90s that his friends were still grossed out by eel. I guess you know. All right, so the next question after that is from Peter Goodman. And he says, when I lived in Japan, ramen was always a cheap snack that you'd get at stalls or maybe late at night. But here in the US, it's become an expensive menu item. And the people who make it are kind of snooty. Is this strictly a US evolution, do you think?
I think maybe the cost of things might be more here, so that it's gotten more expensive. I think there is a culture of celebrity chefs that's more common in the US than in Japan. And that's something I'll have to look into for the book, huh, Peter? I think that that you're right. I mean, ramen in Japan is considered kind of working class. You stand at a stall and you eat fast and you get the hell out of there. The idea of sitting in a restaurant and having ramen for an hour and a half with your friends, that would totally freak out a Japanese restaurant owner. We definitely treat the dish differently. We give it a different cultural weight here. And maybe part of it's because it's still new, but you know, you can get really, really, really good ramen in Japan for under 1,000 yen, you know, under 1,200 yen. So maybe like $11, $9, $10. And here I see a good bowl of ramen can cost $14, $15. So it's a little bit skewed. And maybe when things get more expensive, chefs automatically get snooty. I don't know.
Great. So our next question is from Kenji, who is actually one of our cooking instructors at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center, Kenji Yoko, as it was at Taguma. But Kenji asks, do you know when Japanese rice began to be cultivated in the U.S.? I don't think it was native, but brought over from Japan.
That's an interesting question. I should look into that too, because rice is obviously so important in our cuisine. If you haven't seen it, you should seek out the movie called Seeds. It's about the history of the Kokuho Rose Company, right? That's a company that's featured in it. It's a history of the family, the American JA family in Southern California. They all ended up they were sent to camp, but then they came out and they've continued the company. But the father, the grandfather, originally brought the rice, cultivated it from his origins in Japan. So it's a really fascinating movie. It's called Seeds.
Great. Our next question is from Kathleen, and she asks if we could discuss mochi, and in particular how mochi ice cream has exploded. Because it's my understanding that mochi ice cream was invented in Little Tokyo.
Yeah, Miyakawa, is that the restaurant, the ice cream place? Yeah, and I, like my mom with California rolls, I thought of mochi ice cream as being inchiki. Because growing up, my mom made daifuku mochi. She handmade mochi, you know, using mochiko. She made her own anko. She didn't buy it in a bag. She boiled the beans, added the sugar, and she would sell a tray of daifuku mochi to Japanese supermarkets in Washington, D.C. And once we moved to Denver, here in Denver. And so that's what I think of when I think of mochi, that or like the hard stuff that you know, heat up on a frying pan during New Year's. And I eat it with like a ton of sugar and shoyu, and it's really, 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 really bad for you, but I sure like it. Or you put it into oshiriko, the anko soup for New Year's. But I forget the origins. I will be sure to include it in the book because I'll have a chapter on desserts and sweets and snacks. But mochi ice cream is, even if I think it's an abomination, it has become really popular. And you can get it in almost, well, now you can get it in your regular supermarket. You can go to a Kroger and buy mochi ice cream now, which is pretty amazing to me. It's yet another gateway. All these things are gateways for people who aren't Japanese to get interested in our culture in a kind of a sideways direction, I think. It'll be listed in the chapter on desserts in the book next year. Absolutely.
Mhm. Okay. And I think that speaks to one of my personal pet peeves of people who don't differentiate between mochi itself and mochi ice cream. Think they're the same thing.
Oh yeah,
when they're
yeah.
not.
No, that drives me crazy.
That
Yeah.
and people who can't differentiate between tonkotsu and tonkatsu.
Oh man, I hate it when I'm always correcting people or people who say udon. I like udon.
Mhm. All
Oh,
right. Oh, well, Scott has a quick request for you to provide your email address again. Is that something you can put into the chat box real quick?
yes.
And
Gil
then,
at nikkeiView.com.
we
Or
have
yeah.
we have a two-part question from Hannah, and she asks, "What is the best big food trend from Japan?" And then she also notes that there's so many other offer sushi in addition to say like Chinese cuisine or other Asian cuisines. So, how do you think this has changed Japanese cuisine here?
Wait, say the question again.
So, first part was just what you think the best big food trend from Japan has been, and then the second part is regarding non-Japanese people having opened restaurants that serve Japanese food in addition to other ethnic cuisines, and how that might have affected the Japanese food they serve.
Yeah, the second part of the question first is, there used to be some popular restaurants even in the Denver area that serve like 7 or 8 different cuisines from around the world, and I thought they did a terrible job with Japanese food. Uh, and the idea of fusion as well, I think it's dangerous because I was a music critic, I'm a pop culture fan. I understand that cultures intermingle and we evolve and it's a global marketplace and blah, blah, blah. But I ended up I'm a snob when it comes to Japanese food. And I have written in my blog about how when it comes to things like ramen, I'm kind of racist. Like I I don't know. I have to say that I sushi restaurants and ramen restaurants. I um, I have to know that the people who run them respect the culture. And like Ivan Ramen in New York, the guy is Jewish, white, moved to Japan just so he could like learn ramen and opened a restaurant in Japan that became very respected for ramen, and then went to New York and opened Ivan Ramen. I don't think he's fake. I don't think he's appropriating culture, but the idea of appropriating culture versus appreciating culture, I think, is very important to me. And the idea of restaurants that accommodate culture by serving kind of watered down food, or the idea of California rolls, I'll eat them, but I still don't really. That's one thing that my mom has influenced me with. I think they're in Jiki sushi still. And so it's appreciation versus appropriation versus accommodation, and I kind of juggle them. And I understand that I can't always be a purist. I'm being a jerk if I'm a purist on some things. So I don't know. That's something that's kind of up in the air for me. And I also know that I can't stop it. I used to have very, very strict ideas on what good ramen is. And then, it's like, oh, you should never put broccoli in ramen. That's gross. But, in Japan, people are messing with ramen all the time, coming up with new combinations, new ways to serve it. And I can't be closed-minded. And I understand that.
Sure. So I guess going back to Hera's first part of the question,
Oh,
to
food
clarify,
trend?
she meant was what is the next big food trend you see coming out of Japan?
Next big food trend. All right. Well, I think it's udon noodles. I think it's udon because I think ramen has gotten so much attention, opened people's eyes and palates, and like my mom. I don't know why I keep going back to my mom, but she's always been more of a udon fan. And I remember being in Kagoshima years ago, and my host family taking me to an udon restaurant that was just unbelievably good and amazing. And there's a toothiness to udon noodles that's different from ramen. And you've already seen is it Marugome or whatever, Marugame in LA, and also I think in San Francisco there's a place that serves.
Yeah, they're actually expanding throughout the U.S.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a sign that udon is going to catch on.
And I think in the course of answering that question, you actually answered the next question from Roman, who asked, how is udon actually pronounced? So
Yeah, when servers at a Japanese restaurant, whether they're Asian or non-Asian, if they say udon, I correct them right away. I can't stand it when they say udon. It's udon. So, and I've one of my most popular blog posts ever is a rundown of things that are very commonly mispronounced. Like futon is another one. It's not futon, futon. So, what can I say? I'm a snob.
Well, it's good to get the record straight, right?
Yeah.
All right. Do folks have any other questions? We seem to have gone through the ones that have been submitted so far. Okay. Well, actually, I have a question of my own for you, Gil, and that is, in the course of doing your research so far, is there anything that has surprised you that you've come across, or that you had made assumptions about in the past, but actually turned out to be untrue?
I don't know if it's assumptions that were untrue. There are some things that have that I didn't know. So, like the history of how beef was introduced to Japan, and how the Japanese initially their idea of cooking Western food was very French. So a lot of the first Western restaurants that were fancy and successful in Japan were French restaurants. But then very soon, like they do with a lot of culture, they absorbed it, they turned it around, and they spit it out as something Japanese. And so all the things having to do with beef are very part of the Japanese culture now. But I was a little surprised to find out that the eating of beef wasn't a very common part of the culture in Japan until after Westerners got there.
I see, great. And then I think another question that I had was the aspect of family restaurants here being generational, and how those businesses have survived and kind of been passed through families from generation to generation. Is there some part of your book that might cover that aspect of restaurants, or concerns that we have for future generations carrying on these traditions?
I think it'll probably be part of the chapter about the history of restaurants. There's something to be said about kind of the practicality of opening restaurants, because it's one of the few businesses that you could do, that you were allowed to do, like Chinese restaurants, or people saying Chinese laundries. Well, it's not like the Chinese are experts in laundry. It happened to be one of the businesses that they were allowed to open because they couldn't own any gold mines or, own any other kinds of businesses. I think restaurants for immigrant communities are a very common way to establish yourself, make some money, and then the dream is always to have your children and their grandchildren to not work at the restaurant. They're supposed to go off to college and do something more with themselves. And so there's always that danger that you won't have a legacy, a family to run the family business if you're in a restaurant. And I think that's typical. The couple that just closed 20th Street Cafe in Denver, they have a son who is a chef, but he's a chef in a fancy hotel kitchen here in town. And it's not like he's going to quit that job, to be, to run the family diner and work his ass off, 7 a.m. to whenever, 7 days a week, like his dad did and his grandfather and great grandfather. So I think it's a tough business to continue unless you become so famous, so big that it attracts other people, maybe not your children, but other young people who want to follow in your footsteps and become a sous chef, and then they take over. But you have to be kind of a certain level of restaurant to do that. A family mom and pop shop restaurants aren't really made to hand off to somebody else, So I think there is a danger of that culture fading, but you just kind of assume that there'll be somebody else stepping in to open a restaurant, maybe a new kind of restaurant, maybe a fusion restaurant, someplace that I'll poo-poo at first but fall in love with, and they'll do amazing things, and there's always new restaurants opening. Well, not during the pandemic, and maybe not for a while after the pandemic either, but my favorite ramen shop in the Denver area ended up being a guy from Yokohama who wanted to who went to the University of Colorado, and he just wanted to open a ramen restaurant and make real authentic ramen because he couldn't find any that was very good in this area. And so he opened one, and he hired a guy from Japan, and they did that until he got sick and he had to go back to Yokohama. And then they had to close down the restaurant. But man, for a while there, the Rocky Mountain Ramen was the bomb. They had such good ramen. I used to drink the soup and put it down and go, oh man, that's like I just ate a whole bunch of meat.
All right. Well, do you have time for one more question, Gil?
Sure.
Okay, let's go with one last question from Kathleen. And she asks if you might be able to go into Portuguese influences in Japanese. Castera, and I suppose that includes tempura, right, in Japanese.
Yeah, there are things that are, well, I'll go into the foreign influences, including Portuguese influences, but when you look at kare, Japanese curry is not like any other curry. It's not like Indian curry. It's not like Thai curry. It's a very Japanese curry. And tempura, although it was inspired by and based on like Portuguese deep frying, I think the Japanese tend to take those things and make it a separate cultural element, add their own Japanese filter. Like, I can't imagine having tempura without a dashi to dip it in that's made with katsuobushi, and so I feel like, whether it's katsutera, whether it's, or even like there's, I want to mention like Peruvian Japanese cuisine. That's Japanese who went to Peru and they absorbed kind of the Peruvian cuisine and, but still make kind of Japanese food. There are a couple of terrific restaurants in the LA area that I've had Japanese Peruvian food. And I think there's just an openness in Japanese culture to taking something and absorbing it and spitting it back out as something very Japanese. And I think maybe I have to think through this. Maybe by admitting that, maybe I'm being closed-minded when I say I'm a purist and I'm only want this and this and this, because the Japanese over centuries they haven't been purists. They've accepted a lot of things, and they've, we wouldn't have a green tea culture today if Japan hadn't absorbed Chinese tea, and and then turned it into an entire ceremony and a culture around it. So I think there's something to be said for all the foreign influences in Japanese cuisine.
All right, and then actually we had one last question that snuck in here. So one last question from Hannah. Chow mein is often mentioned as an example of American food that was invented here in America but made by Chinese immigrants. So is there a distinctly Japanese American invention like that? Totally American but of Japanese heritage?
I'm sure there are. Well, in Japan, part of the history of Japanese cuisine is the idea of yoshoku and washoku. Washoku is somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Yoshoku is like traditional Japanese culture. Washoku is Western culture. So like when I said that the early fancy restaurants, that Western restaurants in Japan were washoku, were French, that would be washoku, Japanese making Western, what they perceive to be Western food. So things like omu rice or chicken rice made with rice, and it's fried rice with ketchup, basically. I grew up with my mom making that, and I think those are very Westernized Japanese foods. In terms of something that is strictly Japanese American based on Japanese food, I'm sure there are things. I think the purest expression that I can think of off the top of my head is spam musubi, because it's something that the U.S. military brought to Hawaii and to Korea and other places that somebody just decided to put on top of a block of rice and wrap nori around it. And to skeptical non-Japanese or non-Hawaiians or people who've never heard of it, I just say, think of it as spam sushi. And that makes, they can wrap their heads around that. And I think that's a very, very, very clear-cut example of something that Japanese Americans adapted with materials on hand that's based in kind of a Japanese thing. Or furikake on popcorn in Hawaii, that's another really good example. Your friend from Japan thought it was gross, spam musubi? No, man, spam musubi is, I don't go out of my way to eat spam all the time, but my dad was in the military, so I ate spam growing up, so. Okay, I thought so. Washoku is thank you for correcting me. I thought that I was saying it wrong. Washoku is Japanese, yoshoku is Western cuisine in Japan. So like things like chicken rice or omu rice, that's Western style, even though it's become a Japanese thing. I don't know. I think spam musubi is really the easiest example of something that's purely Japanese American. Or of course the Hawaiians are going to like jump all over me and say it's not Japanese American, it's Hawaiian. But hey, I'll claim it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gil. I think we're going to close off the discussion for now, for today. I just want to remind folks that we have been recording this session. So at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, it will be posted up on the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimages website at jampilgrimages.com. And so you'll be able to watch it there after it debuts at 7 p.m. But again, Gil, it's great to hear from you and see you on screen.
See you too.
Since we've been face to face in person, but I really enjoyed your insights, and I'm, not only am I really hungry now after our discussion, I'm really looking forward to reading your book when it comes out. So you're saying next year from Stonebridge Press, right?
Yes, next year.
Okay. And for everyone in the audience today, we really appreciate you guys joining us for this discussion. And we hope that you not only watch the replay tonight, but also hope that you're tuning into all the other great programs that we're having go on every day until August 16th for the Tadaima Virtual Community Pilgrimage. So with that, I hope that you guys all take care and be well. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And just send me your suggestions, your stories, photos, whatever. I want to stay in touch. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.